We're good? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone. To see a few folks from last week have come back, and I appreciate that, knowing that I'd be here again for this part two of our four-part series on the book of Ruth. I greatly appreciate you didn't make plans ahead of time. You know, growing up, lived on a farm, and two things I detested the most was picking okra and picking blackberries. Okra, if you ever picked okra, you know why. But blackberries, not the tame blackberries, the wild blackberries, you had to go find them. Snakes and chiggers. So one night, I hear my mom and dad talking about we're going to pick blackberries the next morning. Before the sun came up, I was gone. And that was back before cell phones, so I went over to a friend's house and helped them haul hay or something like that, but didn't like picking blackberries. You know, the Bible says that Hades, there's fire and brimstone. I think chiggers ought to be there too. They're brutal. So anyway, thanks again for being here. Just kind of a recap from last week. The book of Ruth is really a book about redemption. We saw last week that based on our flawed human logic, it wouldn't seem that Ruth would be the one that God would use, the one that God would choose to be in the direct lineage of the Messiah. But we saw that God has other ideas sometimes. His ideas and His purposes certainly transcend ours. And sometimes we cannot fathom the wisdom of God. But we also learned last week that despite our frailties and despite our difficulties and our pain and our struggle in this life, that God will use us. He has a purpose for all of us. And He can use us in any way to accomplish His purposes. So the book of Ruth has this, I hate to say it this way, but cast of characters. So you've got a family. Elimelech is the head of the household. He's the head of the family. And they live in Judah, from the tribe of Judah, and they live in Bethlehem. At that time, there's a famine in the land. So Elimelech and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, along with Elimelech's wife, Naomi, decide to go down to the land of Moab, where the Moabites lived, because of the famine. Now, Elimelech and his family are pictured as average Israelites. They're just negotiating their way through everyday life like we all do from time to time. They have authentic Hebrew names that have specific meaning to their names. And given the events of this book, it would just seem like they're an ordinary Jewish Hebrew family. But during the period of the kings, famine often pushed people off their land. If you read in Genesis chapter 2, Abram, who would later become Abraham, leaves his home, or Genesis chapter 12, leaves his home, and he has to go to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. 2 Kings, I think it's chapter 8, I believe. The Shunammite woman whose son Elisha had raised from the dead, Elisha tells her that she needs to go somewhere. He tells her to go away with your family and stay a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. In many instances, a famine was viewed as God's punishment. Sometimes it was, but oftentimes it was viewed as we've done something to evoke God's anger. And so this relocation of Elimelech and his family from Bethlehem down to Moab covers a period of 10 years. And his sons Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women, which in and of itself was not initially prevented by the law of Moses, but the land of Moab was considered a pagan land, and the Moabites were excluded from the assembly for up to 10 generations. So this is not the solution that you would think that God would use, that to send them to this land, a pagan land. And while there, Mahlon and Chilion marry two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then tragedy strikes. Naomi loses her husband Elimelech, and the two sons die. So Naomi is widowed. Ruth and Orpah are widowed. They're facing famine back in their own land. They're facing tragedy in the land which they're living. And she's not only grieving and bereaved of her husband, but she's also past her childbearing years. And so she found herself in the very most extreme and difficult circumstances for a woman, and especially an Israelite woman. We're so sympathetic to her plight because it's such a sad story. She has nothing. I mean, she has no husband to care for her and provide for her. She has no sons. The sons would be the next in line to provide for her. She has no sons. They both died. And so this tragedy happens, and she decides to go back to her land in Judah, back to Bethlehem. And even in doing so, her empathy for others is displayed. She uses the word return. Some translate it go back. Some translate it return home. Some translate it turn back. All depends on your translation, but she uses that phrase 12 times in 17 verses to Orpah and Ruth. Go back, return. She's lost her security and comfort, and she's returning to a life of probably loneliness and despair. And as much as she longed to take her daughters-in-law with her to be a source of strength and comfort to her, she tells them to go back, to return, turn back. Essentially, she realized that if going with them, or them going with her, would be a huge sacrifice on their part, because a woman from this area going over into Judah would face a very difficult life. And so Naomi's lost every source of security and comfort. And in this time, the only career really available for a woman in the Near East is marriage. But she is past that stage. So she's facing a very uncertain future in going back as a widow and childless. Moabite women living in Judah or in Israel would have a very difficult time as well. They wouldn't have very many suitors. But if they remained in Moab, where Naomi wanted them to remain, they would. They would have a better life. And for this reason, Naomi takes it upon herself to remove the very last source of comfort, her daughters-in-law, and asks them to stay. So in chapter 1, when all this plays out, verse 6 and verse 22 are kind of the bookends of this playing out. It's kind of a literary envelope here. And in the section, the story opens with her leaving her homeland with very much hopeful thoughts, and all this tragedy happening and advising her daughters-in-law to stay. And Orpah does. She doesn't want to, but eventually, after much coaxing, she does, never to be mentioned again. And Naomi begins to think about returning to Bethlehem. Naomi's a big character in this story. She's one of the catalysts, as we'll see in the coming chapters. She's one of the catalysts to bring this plan of God's redemption forward. It seems that Naomi is a person of faith and devotion. Her name, as we'll find out here in a bit, she changes the meaning of her name. Don't call me Naomi, call me bitter, call me Mara. So Naomi and Orpah return to their respective homes, and Naomi brings Ruth, her daughter-in-law, with her. Loss and grief and the accompanying loneliness, that can change a person. And no one knew better than Naomi. After moving to a foreign country, which was difficult enough to escape a famine, she comes back with a personal famine, if you will. So here we are for another character of this story of God's redemptive plan. It's Naomi. There are 4 words, 4 simple, short words posed in the form of a question. 4 words that set the stage for Naomi's return to Bethlehem. The question is brought up, chapter 1, verse 19. The whole city stirred up with her return. The whole city is excited and stirred up. But 4 words. Can this be Naomi? She's obviously changed. Something has changed. They knew the Naomi that had left, but now she's come back. Can this be Naomi? Obviously, we change over time. If you have, maybe a child or a cousin or someone, you see them at age 5 and then you don't see them until 10 years later at age 15. They've changed. Well, they see Naomi 10 years later, and the inference from Scripture here is not as much a physical change, it's more of a change in her appearance, her countenance, her way she carries herself. It's a change in her body posture, basically, the way she's carrying herself. She's been beaten down. Can this be Naomi? Naomi, translated sweet, or maybe pleasant. And she's reappeared. She's back. She's back in her hometown. She's one of them again. But I can just imagine if they hadn't seen her for a while, they see someone who looks very sad, perhaps gaunt. but still very, very, very sad. And Naomi said, no, you don't understand. I'm not the same Naomi you knew 10 years ago. Things have changed. Things are different now. All the pain and hardship and scarcity has changed me. So don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Mara is translated bitter. Naomi, sweet, says, no, call me Mara, call me bitter. That's what's happened to me. Almighty God, or the Almighty, as some translations put it, or should I? He's changed me. And she's not blaming God. She's pointing out that she controls nothing. That He controls all things, and He's controlling this situation, and in this instance, things have happened to make her life bitter. That life's not been good lately. It's almost as if she was saying, the old Naomi you knew years ago, the old Naomi that we had good times together, she's gone. She died in Moab. She was once a pleasant or sweet woman living a full life in Bethlehem. Now she returns as an empty, grieving widow. And even her friends and neighbors don't seem to recognize her. That's the basis behind the question, can this be Naomi? Naomi's sweet. Naomi comes back and says, no, I'm bitter. Call me bitter. And the women ask that question. The emphasis is being upon not only have you changed, but this is almost a shock to us. And it says the women are asking this question, which probably means that most of the men are engaged in the barley harvest, which was going on at this time, as most did. You know, early calendars were associated with agricultural cycles. Barley was the first of the cereals that would ripen and be harvested sometime around April. And then the wheat was the last to be harvested, usually in the month of May, somewhere around in there. In later traditions, the barley and wheat harvests became associated and identified with the festivals of Passover and Pentecost. So the season of harvest was a time of celebration. That's why they had these feasts. That's why they had these celebrations. That's why they had the feast of Passover, even though it represented God's passing over the Israelites' homes in Egypt, and it also represented God's love and care for His people. It was also a time for celebration because the barley was being harvested. And then again on the Pentecost, when the wheat was being harvested, it was another celebration. That's why they had a feast and a celebration. Because 10 years earlier, there was a famine in the land and nothing to celebrate. In those days, if you had a good crop, it was worthy of celebration. So that's why these festivals and celebrations were assigned. But Naomi's not there yet. Eventually, we're going to see the fruitful restoration of Naomi and her family and her redemptive, her part in the redemptive plan established, but she's not there yet. The author here, the skill seems to be that he introduces this idea of the harvest as an idea that, hey, here's something to celebrate. Naomi comes back bitter, But it's a time of celebration in this harvest. So he seems to be introducing this concept that, hey, this is a time of celebration, and Naomi's going to be changed again, as we'll see. But she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitter. Naomi, sweet. Mara is bitter. Kind of an illustration of the disastrous changes in her life. This is probably a direct reference to Exodus chapter 15. When the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, they were out of water. And so they're grumbling and complaining, and they did find a source of water. Verse 22, Moses led Israel through the Red Sea. They went to the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding any water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. That's probably where Naomi's getting this same word for bitter. It's this water that the Israelites came upon. They're wandering in the wilderness, in the desert, and they can't find water. And if you've ever been really thirsty, you understand what it's like to really want water, covet water, if you will. So the people were thirsty, and they find water, but they can't drink it. It's bitter. It's Marah. So they grumble. And what are we to drink then? We can't drink this. So they grumble again to Moses, and Moses cries out to the Lord. And the Lord shows him a piece of wood, and Moses throws that wood into the water, and the water becomes fit to drink. Some believe that that's part of this story here, is the way God transforms bitter water into pleasant, drinkable water is what God will do with Naomi when he will transform her from bitter Naomi back to sweet Naomi in the end. Naomi's thoughts of what she believed had happened were her thoughts, but they were by no means correct. In that day, no one knew anything to affix anything to other than God. If something bad happens, then God must be angry with us. If something is a good harvest or the blessing, it's from God. But she had not yet come to realize that just like this water, God could make what's bitter sweet and usable again. She had not quite learned the lesson that Christ would teach to all of us at a later time, that Christians sometimes must suffer. We all must suffer sometimes, and it's painful, and it's difficult. But regardless of our lot in life that we're experiencing, God can make it sweet, just like he can make water drinkable again. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, the Apostle Paul, he was sustained by this marvelous promise when he said, if we suffer or endure with him, we will also reign with him. So in this dramatic events, if you think about it, this is, and I said last week there was a movie about the story of Ruth that was made around 1960, I think. But this has a great plot to it. I mean, she faces tragedy. She comes back to a life of difficulty. She has her daughter-in-law with her, and this redemption that she's awaiting, it just seems impossible at the time. Naomi could not understand yet that God would bring about the birth of the Messiah directly through this lineage, and that Naomi was going to play a part in this. In verse 21, though, she's not there. She still is, the Lord has afflicted me. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. The Lord has afflicted me. That's the NIV translation. That's not the best translation. Actually, the best translation is probably from the King James, which I believe says, Jehovah hath testified against me. The word affliction is basically a change by the translators, translating from the Hebrew to the Greek, and it's probably not the best. Naomi doesn't blame her misfortune, in essence, on God. She says it's because of him. She's not blaming. She says it's my lot because that's what God has allowed to happen. But she uses a rare Hebrew name for him here when she says, because the Almighty. It's a word that I think it's pronounced sade, but it's a word that emphasizes irresistible strength. In other words, God's irresistible strength has brought this about, and there's nothing that I can do. It doesn't help to blame God for this, but there's also nothing that I can do to do anything about it. I am in God's hands completely. He's brought this misfortune. But afflicted is used by many translators, that the Lord has afflicted this on me. And that's probably not the best translation. Affliction and testify, which is the better translation, are not the same word. Affliction is just an out-and-out punishment. It's like Job was afflicted with boils on his skin. God afflicted the Israelites with a plague, or sores, or painful boils, as he did in one of the plagues in Egypt. Affliction is a state of just being affected by something that causes physical pain, sometimes extreme unhappiness. Testify, though, means to bear witness. It's a legal term. To give or provide evidence. In this instance, Naomi is saying that God has testified against me, and here is the witness testimony. I was once sweet Naomi, now I'm Mara, bitter. I am without my husband. I am without my sons. Here is the evidence that God has testified against me. I went away full. I left as a wife and a mother, but I returned as a widow and childless. What more evidence do you need to see to regard me as bitter, as Mara? So upon her return, Naomi's probably hardly recognizable. She's instructing the ladies of Bethlehem, don't call me Naomi or pleasant anymore. Call me bitter. And in this section's concluding verse 22 kind of summarizes. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. All right, she's back. Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, from down here, they're back. And Naomi's going to be the catalyst here in the coming chapters. But Naomi coming back, even though she's bitter, her name now is bitter in her mind. Even though all these things have happened, she's going to be the catalyst to bring about this story of God's redemption for His people. Ruth, though, probably also is coming to a life of uncertainty, of difficulty. She's a pagan woman. Even though she said, your God will be my God, your people will be my people, she's facing a difficult time. She's excluded from the assembly because she's a Moabite. So she's facing a life of difficulty. And Naomi, because of her husband and sons dying, there's no heir to pass on not only property, but to carry on the name, which will play a very big role in this story coming up, because they will have to then find the kinsman redeemer, the one next in line that can redeem not only the property, but redeem this family. So in essence, Naomi was prominent. She had to be well known because they recognized her, and she was from a good standing family. From everything we know, that Elimelech was well regarded. He was very prominent. She was a wife and a mother. She was pleasant. But she became, can this be Naomi? She obviously changed. She's a widow and she's childless. And now she's bitter. Not bitter as in her personality, but bitter as in, this is a bitter pill to swallow, so to speak. Now, they arrive back in Bethlehem. Barley harvest is beginning. So chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, which is going to be very important. His name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, well, she's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather here among the sheaves behind the harvesters. So she came into the field and has remained here from morning until now. Except she did take a short rest in the shelter. So it just so happens they get back and this barley harvest is happening. They have really no way to provide for themselves because the head of the household, Elimelech, is now passed and both sons have died. They really have no way to provide for themselves, so they really have to go out and basically participate in this welfare system, so to speak, where the harvesters are gleaning what's left over from the harvest. But she just happens to go to a field who is in the clan of Elimelech. If you remember from the law of Moses, land and property had to stay within their clan. You weren't allowed to permanently sell land to another clan. It had to stay in that clan. And so Boaz, a man of standing, or a mighty man of wealth, the the Hebrew words that are translated into the Greek in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The translation into the Greek translates it as a mighty man of valor. That's the same phrase that's used in Judges chapter 11 to refer to Jephthah. So he can maybe considered not only a man of standing, but a man of valor. Just a man that's casts a large shadow. A man of not only of standing and of wealth, but a man of valor. He has a huge presence to him. The name Boaz, the meaning of the name Boaz is in him is strength, or fleetness. His name is actually assigned to the north or left pillar, however you want to look at it, of the temple that Solomon built. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 7, the pillar's named Boaz, the Boaz pillar. So in other words, in complete contrast to Naomi, who says, I'm now no longer pleasant, but I'm Mara or bitter, certainly this man, a strong, noble character with many virtues of goodness and kindness and compassion, surely he can help change her outlook. So he's part of the family, so to speak. Don't know for certain, but the tradition is that Elimelech or Boaz was Elimelech's nephew, so that was his uncle. So Ruth says, "Let me go and glean." As the younger and stronger of the two women, Ruth decided that she should take the initiative here, take advantage of the harvest season, and glean some barley, some ears of barley or stalks of barley that had been left behind, because there was no other way that they could get food. Law of Moses, as we mentioned last week and again earlier in Leviticus and also in Deuteronomy, specifies strict rules on harvesting, that they were only go through one time. They weren't to harvest to the edges of the field, and they couldn't go back and reharvest or pick up what they missed. They weren't allowed to go back a second time into the same field. If they overlooked a bundle of grain, they were forbidden to go back and get it, because that's the way foreigners and the poor and the widows in Naomi's case, that's how they got their food. Same rules applied to vineyards and orchards. That was God's way of providing for the less fortunate, the downtrodden, the powerless. Ruth says, "Let me go." She not only requested permission from her mother-in-law, but she also asked and received permission from the overseer of the harvest worker. So she's doing her very best to be respectful in all of this. She wants to do the right thing. She wants to make sure that not only they understand, but they respect what she's trying to do here. Because a woman in one of these fields was often a dangerous place to be. There was very little protection. They were there because they had to be there. They were there because they were powerless, and that made them a target and source of being oppressed and sometimes attacked. So Naomi says, "Go ahead, my daughter," which could mean several things if you think about it. It could just be nonchalant. Sure, go ahead. If you have my blessing, go right ahead. Pick up some milk while you're out. Go right ahead. Or it could be more of a parent-child type interaction. Go ahead, my daughter, but be careful. Mind your manners. Don't goof off. Don't dilly-dally around. Go. Or I believe, given in this context, and Naomi's self-description in chapter 1 of call me bitter, I think she's kind of lowering her head, probably in somewhat shame and embarrassment, thinking about the life she had, thinking about all that she used to have, and now she's having to rely on the leftovers of a field, which would basically depend on the skill or lack thereof of the harvesters, hoping they'll leave some behind. So maybe she just kind of bowed or lowered her head and says, "Go ahead, my daughter. Nothing else we can do." The author of this book hasn't given yet the suggestion that Ruth may ultimately provide the answer to Naomi's plight, but he's beginning to prepare us, and he's prepared for the next chapter of this story, and relating to the time of the year when this barley harvest is beginning. He's setting the stage, the writer is setting the stage for this redemptive plan to be put in action. When you get through the book of Ruth and you go back and you understand how all these things happened, it's an incredible story of redemption. So Naomi and Ruth, they come back to Bethlehem. And the struggle and pain and difficulty that they're facing is right there in front of them. And the cup of pain is a bitter cup, as Naomi said. But God is not done with this situation. He's not done. Because Naomi's recovery and redemption will come later. Your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons. She's given birth. This also begins our redemption. How we all fit in this through the Messiah. But Naomi would find out that sometimes we must travel through life's darkest times before we get to the most difficult, or go through the most difficult times before we get our redemption. After all, it was Naomi's great-great-grandson, sort of, who wrote, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me." Naomi's great-great-great-grandson, sort of, David, wrote those words. And David will become a key cog in the lineage all the way that leads to the Messiah, which leads to the cross, which leads to our redemption. So we'll find out next week in Lesson 3 how God is at work, not only then, but also now. Thank you.